back in Norway, at least, threatening people is not a nice thing to do. You could actually go to jail just for threatening people. But, giving promises, on the other hand, is something else. And with my previous employer, I used to tell people that, I don't really like physical violence at all. So instead I can give you a practical demonstration of how to delete somebody's social security number, as an example. And most people actually really understood what I was saying with that. So, well, with that, no more stories for now from Norway. This is Cormac Herley from Microsoft Research. And I have, before I will leave the stage, Cormac, I have something that is, to me personally, very important to do, because this is Cormac Herley at Microsoft Research. And I'm just going to do it like this. No pressure, Cormac, no pressure. But this guy has done so many excellent papers, academic papers, like research papers, on passwords and security usability. I'm really looking forward to this talk. So by that, Cormac, be my guest.
Thank you for that introduction. Also, we forgot to mention legendary blues guitarist and voted 2015 sexiest man alive. So you're just going to mix stuff up. You might as well make up more interesting stuff. Anyway, thank you very much. So pushing on string, adventures in don't care regions of password strength. And so password strength, we pursue it endlessly, we talk about it a lot, we reason about it a lot, we do all sorts of stuff to pursue it, and yet we never seem to get there. We always have these, those endless series of stories about how badly users choose passwords, all of our efforts, including password meters and awareness campaigns and tips, and it seems a problem that is largely kind of resistant to our effort. Why? What is fundamentally wrong here? Why are we not getting what we want? And so, why do we want strength? What is it that we want? Well, what we really want, I think, is not strength itself. What we want is to deny access to bad guys. And those sound like they're exactly the same thing, and often they are, but sometimes they're not. And that's what I want to pursue here. And I think they're not the same thing a lot more often than you might imagine. So why do we want strength? How much strength do we need? The answer to that question always seems to be more. But I think that's based on sort of imprecise thinking. And if you kind of make your assumptions and desires and goals a little more explicit, we can actually figure out what can we accomplish and what can we not accomplish, and not be in this endless death march where we never seem to reach our goal. And does more strength always help with our goal? As I said, we don't really want strength. We want to deny access to bad guys. Does more strength always help deny access? And the answer to that question, I think, is no. Even when it's just guessing attacks we're talking about, there are circumstances, and they're very common, where it's a guessing attack you're worried about, and you can be increasing the strength of the passwords chosen by your user population, and it has absolutely no effect on the outcomes that you experience. That sounds a little counterintuitive, but I think it's actually at the heart of why much of things go wrong with our attempts to improve user behavior. So first of all, we're going to talk about strength. How do we measure the strength of a password, a single password? Well, but before, many of this audience probably doesn't need to be told it, but for crying out loud, let's stop using this entropy thing, this length times log 2 of the size of the character set. It's a kind of a crude proxy that people used at some point. But here, just to demonstrate how bad it is, this is a subset of passwords chosen from the Rocky distribution. And what I'm graphing is this entropy measure on one side and how common the passwords on the other. And if the entropy were a good measure of how easy something is to guess, then this would be monotonically decreasing. It would be monotonically going down from left to right. You can see that it's not even approximately doing that. It's not even close. There are lots of things over here. So this is to help. This is the most common password. This is occurring something like more or less 1 million times in the Rocky data set. So that's ABCDEFG or something like that. And here, all the way down here, are a bunch of things that occur only once. And what's going on here is there are lots of things that are pretty good passwords because they occur only once. They're very, very uncommon, and they have entropy that goes from very, very high to actually things that are extremely low. but conversely, there are also things that that have what is considered high entropy, but are actually really bad passwords because they're really common. So here is basically, these are lots of, this entropy measure is giving us lots of weak passwords that it considers strong, and lots of, what are really good, strong passwords that it considers weak. It's just doing a really rotten job of what we want. So what I think, the community has kind of, converged on the last couple of years is using one or other of these guess number measures, which is to say, how many guesses does it take to get to a particular password based on something like John the Ripper or based on, Bono measure or something like that. There are several different out there, and, there's arguments to be made for and against each of them, but, the worst of them is definitely far better than the best of the crude entropy measures. So that's how do you measure the strength of a password. But suppose I'm an administrator and I'm administering a site or an enterprise network, and I've got a population of, if it's Microsoft, it's like 100,000 employees, and and obviously a greater number of consumers using consumer platforms. But I don't want to protect a password. I want to protect a distribution of passwords. It's a population. So what do I want now? And the reflex answer, as always, is more. I want everyone to choose I want everyone to choose 40-character random passwords. And, well, good luck with that. You're not going to get it. If the tricks we had around user awareness and tips and slogans and password meters, if they were going to work, they would have worked by now. Where that ain't getting us where we thought we need to go. Let's figure out if where we thought we needed to go, that is to have everybody with super strong passwords, whether we actually need that, and if there's something less than that that will suffice, how do we actually get there? So the administrator's task is essentially to say, he's defending not a single password, but the whole population. And so the question is not, how do I come up with tips to choose super strong passwords? The question is, given a population of what are going to be user-chosen, not machine-chosen and assigned passwords, given a population of user-chosen passwords, how do I best use the effort and energy of my user population to get to something that I can defend? And it's not, again, I don't want to use an abstract measure of strength around the distribution. My goal, essentially, is best worded, in English first rather than mathematics, which is I want to deny the bad guy access to my network. If I'm defending the Microsoft network against guessing attacks, I want to keep bad guys guessing their way in. There are other vectors where they can get in, but if that's what I want from the password distribution, I want to. So it's worth considering, when I look at this, this is kind of a, log 10 of number of guesses using something, like and this is the fraction of a constant or compromise, as you get more and more guesses to John the Ripper or something like that, eventually everything falls, but some of them fall very early. And it's worth asking, considering the question of, well, suppose I have some kind of an awareness campaign and everybody improves their password a little. Well, is that really what I want? Because the ones out here are really not really much of a threat at all, and there seems to be a lot of threat here. If I can pour my effort into different places, where do I want to pour it to get the maximum effect? How do I focus the energy rather than having a scattershot approach, which maybe gets everybody to improve a lot, but doesn't? My goal, remember, is not to get everybody to improve a lot. My goal is not to increase fractionally this kind of platonic good password strength that we're talking about. My goal is to deny bad guys access to my network. That is my goal, and I am successful insofar as I succeed and improve that, and I am unsuccessful insofar as I do anything else, no matter what kind of mathematical rationalization I have for whatever proxy I'm using. So how much strength do I need to do that, to keep the bad guys off my network, to deny them access? Well, in particular from guessing attacks. Well, there are two very, very different types of guessing attacks. One is, roughly speaking, online and offline. And online, roughly speaking, is computed on my hardware. The guy is sending guesses and my server is doing the checking. And the tools I have against that are things like lockout and rate limiting and forensics and IP, blacklisting and stuff like that. And then there's offline, where generally speaking, when it's against a web server or something like that, it kind of means that the guy got in and stole my hash password file, hopefully hash password file, and then he's computing on his hardware. And he's limited only by his hardware, or not necessarily his hardware, whatever number of virtual machines he can steal from Azure or Amazon or anyone else. He's limited only by hardware, but he needs to steal the hash password file. So just before deep diving into that, it's important, but it can never be stressed enough. I think that there's a lot of places where strength has absolutely no influence. I mean, it has identically zero. The good, bad, and the ugly all fall at the same time, independently of whether the password was ABCDEFG or was something 40 characters long. And it's commoner than any of us perhaps want to really admit. When you've got a database breach and the passwords are stored plain text, well, it doesn't really matter. It always sort of, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills when people look at a data breach of something that was stored plain text and they say, look how stupid the passwords the users were choosing. I said, well, no, I think the stupid people in that distribution were the ones who had the long 40-character passwords because they wasted effort when the real threat was that it was stored plain text and it was all going to breach. Given that it wasn't properly protected, you might as well spare your effort. So I drew this little decision tree of when is offline. Offline is clearly a much more serious threat in terms of the number of guesses that somebody can try against you. So here's a kind of just a little decision tree of showing when is offline guessing a factor. And first of all, so here's your password file up here, minding its own business, sitting happily on your server. And there's two possible cases. It either leaks or it does not leak. Well, if it doesn't leak, there's no offline attack, and and that's a really good place to be. You want to make a lot of effort to make sure that your password file does not leak. If it does leak, then you either detect that fact or you do not detect that fact. If you detect it, it's not trivial by any means, but every service essentially needs to have a backup plan in order to do a reset reset credentials across the service if you detect that that has happened. So if it leaks and the leak goes undetected, now it comes down to how is the stuff stored. If it's plain text, well, then no guessing is needed. The guy just has the password, so we're off the races. He just reads them off. If it's hashed and unsalted, rainbow tables pretty much give you most. It's not as bad as plain text, but it's fairly close. I think it was the LinkedIn distribution was stored, hashed but not salted, and 80% or so were broken in a matter of days. If it's salted and hashed, then that's what we talk about where cracking and offline guessing is really a factor. The last option, reversibly encrypted, which people tend to not talk about so much. But again, there are two options. The key either leaks or it does not leak. And if the key leaks, well, it's kind of back to plain text again, right? The guy just decrypts and we're off the races. If the key doesn't leak, well, now he's guessing against, he really doesn't have that much better an attack than doing online. So effectively, if you draw this tree, the only real path that you ought to be worried about, where offline guessing is a factor, is where things were correctly stored, salted, and hashed. If you did anything else, there's really not an offline, or in other words, the strength that you were trying to cull from your user population to resist offline guessing is immaterial if you don't end up in this particular box. Or, in other words, in particular, if you're storing your passwords plain text or reversibly encrypted, then steps to go beyond the strength that is necessary to resist an online attack are simply unjustifiable, right? There's really not a scenario where there's going to be an offline attack, and trying to asking your user population to do anything that goes beyond resisting an online attack is just theater. It's really not. There is not an attack scenario in which that additional strength makes a difference. And this is commoner than I think people think. So here's a list of some of the recent password breaches. And RockU, of course, was famously plaintext encrypted. Tianyo was a Chinese company of similar size, 35 million. And if you look down through the list, I mean, in only two of these, in Gawker and Evernote, were things hashed and salted so that offline guessing beyond rainbow tables was actually both necessary and possible. In other words, in most of the breaches that we've seen, you know, all this talk about cracking and resisting offline, not a factor at all. There was a simpler attack that yielded the passwords just in plain text without resorting to any of this John the Ripper stuff. And if we're going to store things that way, then you know it's sort of indefensible to ask, and unnecessary and wasteful to ask the user population to choose things to protect against an attack that has no possibility of actually happening. Anyway, so that's when when there's strength has absolutely no influence because, well, you just stored it the wrong way and strength never had an option to come into play. But in addition, when guessing really is the vector and there is, and things have been stored correctly, strength doesn't always have the more, you know, more is always good effect that I think we've fallen into thinking. And so, how many guesses, if we're talking about you know, our proxy for password goodness as guess persistence, how many guesses does a password need to withstand in order to be safe? Well, it depends. What kind of attack are you talking about? And here are roughly the numbers, and I'll justify them a little. That, you know, there's online and there's offline, and then there's kind of breadth first, where somebody's just going against the population, and then there's depth first, where they really want you. And the numbers that I think are online breadth first, you need to be able to withstand about 10 to the 4, that is 10,000 guesses. Depth first, that is somebody's going against you, you probably need to be able to stand up to 10 to the 6, that is 1 million. Offline breadth first, you need to be able to withstand about 10 to the 14, and offline depth first, you need to be able to withstand about 10 to 20 or something like that. And here are examples of the kind of passwords that will, you know, withstand those. You see, you know, 10 to the 4, 4-digit PIN pretty much will, you know, is what you need. And note the absolutely enormous difference between online and offline. To be safe from an online, you know, if you can withstand 10 to the 6 guesses, your password is probably going to be good enough to withstand online guessing, you know, feasible online guessing attack against a well-maintained server. For offline, you need to withstand, it looks like, on the order of a minimum of 10 to the 14 guesses. That's an 8 order of magnitude difference. Now, it's easy when we talk about crypto, kind of like, you know, orders of magnitude get slung around, but, you know, 8 orders of magnitude is a lot. 8 orders of magnitude, just to kind of like give you an analogy, it's about the difference between the size of Per's head and the planet Earth. I mean, that's 8 orders of magnitude. It's big. So the reasoning, just quickly, the reasoning that took me to this is so I'm assuming for the offline case that it's salted and hashed correctly, that the hash has not been iterated. And I'm going to talk about hash iteration a little bit later. And it's basically a 4-month campaign. In each of these online and offline, breadth first and depth first, I'm talking about somebody who's putting 4 months worth of the most effort they can into getting one of these accounts. So online breadth first, you can get to 10 to the 4. Where, you know, this was sort of assuming, you know, that your user population has 1 legitimate login per day and a 5% fail rate. And if he's going to send 10 to the 4 against everyone, against every single one of your users, then he's sending on the order of 17,000 more fail events than the rest of your user population combined, which is something that, you know, ought to be detectable in your log files and ought to be remediable through IP blacklisting and stuff like that. I don't want to drill too far down on that, but it's doable. Online depth first, 10 to the 6. Well, you know, this is addressable through lockout and rate limiting. There's no reason why a well-maintained server should allow 1 million fails consecutively with different distinct passwords against, you know, a single account.
The offline breadth first is where, this is, the numbers get a little woollier because he's running on his hardware and we don't actually know how much hardware he has. But let's assume that he's got something like 1,000 GPUs, which he borrowed or rented or stole from, an online provider. Each of them doing 10 to the 10 guesses per second, which I think is what GPUs currently more or less doing. And he sends this guess volume against 10 to the 6 accounts for 4 months. And offline is the same as that, the same hardware, but he sends it against 10 accounts for 4 months. He's got a certain guess budget. He just flings, what he can do in. So those are where I get those numbers: 10 to the 4, 10 to the 6, 10 to the 14, 10 to the 21. Now, here's the thing: when there's no gain in exceeding the online threshold when you fall short of the offline one. That is to say, remember I said that for online, and the online, here's your risk of being guessed if your password will withstand, here's log 10 of the number of passwords. This with here will withstand 10 to the 4 guesses. If you'll only withstand, no guesses, well, your risk of being guessed by an online guy is extreme. But as you withstand more and more guesses, it gets better and better and better, and by the time you get to 10 to the 6 or so, you're kind of good against the online guy. Now, the red line here is, well, what do you need to stand up to an offline guy? Well, you know what, if he can say, it doesn't even start to get interesting until we get to something like 10 to the 14, and then it kind of drops, and by 10 to the 20 or 10 to the 21, you're probably more or less safe. In between 10 to the 6 and 10 to the 14, what happens? Well, nothing happens, right? Nothing happens. That is to say, suppose you've got a password here that will withstand 10 to the 12 guesses. Well, no prizes for trying, right? You will withstand an online guessing attack, but so would one at 10 to the 6 guesses. You will not withstand an offline guessing attack. There are no prizes whatsoever for jumping over the first hurdle but failing to get to the second hurdle. And remember I said those hurdles are 8 orders of magnitude apart. So if the first hurdle is, let me not use Per's head as an analogy anymore, if the first hurdle is 6 inches, I don't know what that is in meters, but 6 inches off the ground, the next one, 8 orders of magnitude, is 10,000 miles. So in other words, you've got 2 hurdles. One is you've got to jump 6 inches, the other one is 10,000 miles. Now suppose you really train yourself and instead of jumping 6 inches, you manage to jump 1 mile. Well, whoopity-doo, good for you, you accomplished nothing, right? You've got to go all the way to 10,000 miles or you get no return whatsoever on your effort. Assuming, we'll revisit these numbers and how hard the 10 to the 6 and 10 to the, sure.
First of all, if there are any reporters in the room now, please do stories explaining the difference between online and offline password attacks, because there are almost none of those stories out in the media. It's very important to get it out. People don't know, they don't understand the difference between online and offline attacks. So do those stories. Second, for you, it's more like, this is, to me, this is, statistical entropy of passwords.
Right.
In a couple of weeks now, there will be lots of people out there in large and small organizations using September 2015 or September 15 as the password, of course, with a capital S at the start.
Yep.
And September 2015 is actually a long password.
Yep.
But still, we can absolutely, I think we can agree, it's a bad password in a couple of weeks from now.
Yeah, no, and kind of pursuing the proxy goal of some strength measure that you've rationalized yourself into believing, accomplishes something, but doesn't accomplish the actual goal, which is denying the bad guy access, right? And that is a fatal flaw when we have a proxy for what we actually want, which diverges from delivering us what we actually want.
Yeah, because with this audience discussing password strength,
right.
Trust me, there's an ongoing discussion.
Right. And if there are any reporters in the room, if you're going to write about online offline, also mention a bit about, Per bowing down before me at the start. Don't forget that part. Anyway, so the numbers I put in, but here basically, here's a graph of, log 10 of the number of guesses that a password will withstand. And here's, so remembering again, as an administrator, I'm not interested in a password, I'm interested in my distribution of passwords. I'm interested in my, I apologize to the people at the back who are standing up and can't read the lines at the bottom. But here's the distribution of passwords, and they fall, with certain number of guesses. But let's call T0 the minimum number of guesses to be safe, or the maximum number of guesses that an online guessing attack might give me, and T1 to be the minimum to be safe from an offline guy. In between here, I just hit this dead zone where increasing strength just gets me nothing. If you're going to, once you get just epsilon beyond here, if you're going to improve your password from that point, you need to get all the way to the other side, or you get nothing in return. You need to get all the way across there. Okay, so that's one what I would call input to the dead zone, where there's just you're increasing strength. You're getting you ask your population to increase strength. You're getting what you asked for, but you're not getting what you wanted. And the gap between what you ask for and what you want is very, 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 very important. But there's more. What I call the compromise saturation point. So let's do a thought experiment. Suppose I'm an administrator, and I'm administering, a corporate network of 100,000 to 100,000 employees or so. If an attacker has 20% of my credentials, he's got 20% of passwords. Am I 20% owned, or am I fully owned? You're fully owned. I mean, for example, in the RSA breach, it started as a phishing attack. Two small groups of employees, none of whom were particularly high profile or high value, were basically phished. Starting from, on the order of, it seems like, half a dozen credentials, they were able to, compromise, the keys of, and RSA is my guess would be above average in terms of, sensitivity to NSA got comprehensively beaten by, one, particular, one person with one access to it. And there's been a bunch of things on sort of snowball attacks within corporate networks, where once you get one set of credentials, it snowballs out rapidly to others. Or look at it another way. I mean, if an attacker already has n of my credentials, how much more does he get by getting one more? Now, when he's got one, if he's got 0 credentials, 1 is really good. Now he's got something he's in. Now he's got 2, he's got more. He's got 3, well, get that somewhat better. When you get to, say, let's say 100, when I've got 100 passwords, how much more does the 101st get? Well, it's kind of diminishing. Once I have my beachhead, the set of things to which I am denied access on the network starts to shrink very rapidly. Or look at it from the other end of the spectrum and say, here, let's say there's an organization of 100,000 people, and I've got all but one of the passwords on the network. What resources on this network are denied? Nothing, absolutely nothing, right? If I've got 50% of them, same thing. You have, essentially either all of the boxes or the administrator of all the boxes. You can work your way sideways, you can get everything. So, yes?
Yes, but gaining access to the account of Bill Gates is like, that is the one big thing. So,
absolutely, but if you get access to, there are 2 parties, let's say, to every email. So without having access to Bill Gates' email, you'll get to see all of the emails that from the other parties, right? So the claim essentially is that the additional gain decreases steadily with the number of credentials that you've got. Now, if you're getting a beachhead, your gain, decreases.
So it's like Amdahl's law applied to passwords.
It's whose law?
Amdahl's law.
Amdahl's, yeah.
The incremental gain of adding additional processor.
Yeah,
Going from 1 to 2 processors doubles.
Yeah.
Each additional incremental gain is less than.
I mean, it's certainly his gain saturates, I think, quite quickly. And I think I'm not ready to put a precise kind of mathematical formula on it, but I think it's reasonable to say that the fraction of resources controlled by the attacker, or 1 minus the set of stuff that is denied to him, increases very rapidly. So here is the fraction of credentials that he has between 0 and 1. Here he controls everything, and so nothing is denied to him. Here he hasn't anything yet. But once he gets his beachhead, things get up very, 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 very rapidly. So and it diminishes. Well, if it's monotonically decreasing, it's necessarily much faster than linear. And at some point it saturates. At some point, I don't know whether it's 100, whether it's 1% or 2% or 5% or 10%. But I'm going to assume it has this kind of a shape to it, and we can argue, and we will, I'm sure, about where the knee of the curve is. But I'm going to call alpha SAT. I'm going to call that the point at which his control effectively saturates, where adding additional credentials doesn't really, I already have 100 credentials, 101 isn't going to get me more that I don't already have. That's the essential. And so this is going to be clearly very different across organizations. RSA got, comprehensively, owned by a fairly small number of credentials. But it's going to be very different for a website, than, let's say, an enterprise network. And here I'm chiefly interested in enterprise networks. But I think by the time someone has 10% of your credentials, I think it's fair to say you're pretty much owned. There's not many things that he wants access to that are password enabled that are now denied to him. So once he's got 10%, he's kind of got as much as he's going to get from the password from the password part. Okay, well let's think through the implications of that, shall we? So remember before we had this thing and I said, well, I showed you this, there was a chasm T0, T1, and there was this online-offline chasm where increasing strength had absolutely no influence on outcomes. Well, now in addition, there's another axis here. This is log 10 of the number of guesses a password will survive. And this is the fraction of credentials compromised that are already compromised by an attacker. Well, and let's say here, this is 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, and so on. Well, if he effectively, if alpha sat is, let's say here it's on this line showing it at 15%, then everything above this, he's not really denied anything anymore. That's also part of the dead zone. That's also a place where increasing password strength gets you absolutely nothing. It costs you, but it gets you nothing. It gets you nothing in the sense that there is no attack scenario where it improves outcomes. There's no attack scenario where it does, remember what it was we were trying to do on the first slide, deny access to the attacker. We're not trying to increase some platonic notion of strength. We're trying to deprive an attacker access to resources that he seeks. And once he's exceeded this alpha sat point, we no longer have that. He pretty much has got everything that he wants. So here, what I'm saying is, T0 is the maximum number of guesses to be safe from online. T1 is the minimum number of guesses to be safe from an offline attack. And alpha sat is the point at which, the attacker control of whatever it is he can get from passwords effectively saturates. And these blue regions here, these are just don't care regions where you can do whatever you want to your password distribution in this space. You can, make it go, up, down, or sideways. It does not influence outcomes. This is just a dead zone where strength is not influencing anything. So to put that in some kind of bullet points. There's no security improvement for increasing the strength between T0 and T1. That's the gap between the online and the offline chasm. But also, once alpha sat is reached, once he has that number of credentials, additional strength denies the attacker nothing. It costs you, but it denies him nothing. And here's the key one: the password distribution. If you believe this, if you believe my analysis, and we couldn't argue about it, but if you believe my analysis, then the password distribution must be below alpha sat at T1. It must be below the point where attacker control saturates at the point where you can be somewhat sure of withstanding an offline guessing attack. It must, or what? Or you've wasted all of the effort that you invested above and beyond withstanding an online attack. So remember, an online attack, we were talking about like 6-digit pins. You can have your user population jumping through hoop for you, having 20-digit random, or you can have 50% of your population choosing random 20-character, 40-character, truly cryptographically strong things, and still have an outcome that is no better than if none of them had exceeded the online an online guessing attack. So let me just kind of is on this slide or that slide? Yeah, the don't care region. So here, the don't care region. It's just the same graph as before. But what I wanted to call out here is, look, I've kind of drawn on here a couple of speculative curves. And generally, we said these curves are, this is the fraction of credentials from a password population that falls with a certain number of log 10 of guesses here. Here's my T0, again, that's the online, that's the offline, and here's alpha SAT. And generally, we said, well, strength is good, guessing resistance is good, which means that, the lower a curve is here, the smaller the fraction of credentials that will be compromised at a certain guess level. So here, look, for example, at the green curve and the blue curve. Well, the green curve here seems to be far better than the blue curve in the sense that, let's say, way out here, there's an enormous difference between the fraction of credentials that are compromised at this point. But you know what? It doesn't matter. You get absolutely nothing for that additional gain. Because at T1 here, this is the point where, until you get to here, you're basically going to be toasted by an offline, a well-resourced offline guessing attack. Well, an offline guessing attack on the green curve, he's going to get about 22% of your credentials. And on the blue curve, he's going to get about 44% of your credentials. Doesn't make any difference, right? When you're owned, you're owned. When you're cooked to that degree, whether it was 22% or 44%. So in other words, and I've drawn these so that they're kind of the same up as far as the online threshold. So from a security point of view, from an outcome point of view, the green curve here and the blue curve have the same security outcomes. They don't cost the same. This one costs your user population far less. This one costs, here, all of this additional effort, which is put in by some of your people at the end of the distribution, choosing super strong passwords, gets you nothing. It's kind of like the business of, teaching the bear to dance. The dancing isn't very good, and it's just annoying the bear, basically. Okay, so are we happy with this? I mean, this is unsatisfactory. I mean, what can we do about this? So there were a bunch of, what are the variables? What do we control? What do we want, and what do we control? What do we want? I mean, I think the same thing that I said on the first slide. We want to deny the bad guy access to our stuff. And if I'm an administrator, I want to deny the bad guy access to not just my stuff, it's the stuff on the network. What do I control? What are the knobs that I can turn in order to try to get that? Well, the things I introduced here, there was T0, T1, alpha SAT, and then there's the password distribution itself. And so, how can I go about? I do apologize to the people at the back here. It's kind of hard to see the. But so alpha SAT is the point at which attacker control effectively saturates. Well, that's kind of a property of the network. And so that is really addressed through normal network hygiene things like least privilege access, compartmentalization. It's not really something that's under the control of the authentication or password. I mean, you shouldn't have if you set up a network where every user has root access on every machine, that is really, really bad, right? If you have a network where people only have the privilege that they actually need, that is better. Somehow things always manage to creep, and no one says, "Hey, I don't need that admin access anymore." But it's that's addressed through the normal kind of policy stuff. T0. This is, remember again, this is the maximum number of guesses to be somewhat, to be safe from online guessing attacks. Well, that is addressable largely through things like throttling and that is pulling this number back, making sure that an online guesser, instead of being able to send you 10 to the 6 guesses, as I said, maybe only 10 to the 3 or 10 to the 4, is addressable through good throttling techniques so that it's hard for somebody to send a million guesses against any one of your accounts. What about T1? Well, T1 is, remember, that is the minimum number of guesses to be somewhat safe against a well-resourced offline attacker. And I don't really control its resources, but one assumption I did make in there was I said salted, hashed, but not iterated. One thing we can do there, which does pull this back, is hashed iteration. I'll talk about that in just a second. And then the final thing we can do is improve user-chosen passwords. So basically what I can do is I can try to push alpha SAT up, but that's a network thing and very hard to control. I can do throttling here to try to pull this in. I can do hash iteration to try to pull T1 to the left. And then I can try to control the password distribution using, the usual mix of awareness campaigns and whatever else we do. Just look briefly at hash iteration to decrease T1. I mean, so I said, I came up with this number of 10 to the 14 that I thought was reasonable for a well-resourced attacker, assuming no iteration on a 4-month campaign. If I iterate the hash 10x, I reduce T1 by 10x. In other words, I take it from, iterate your hash a factor of 10, you reduce it from 10 to 14 down to 10 to the 13, which is a good deal, which is a very good deal. Now, can we iterate until, let's say, I can pull that all the way down to 10 to the 6 or so that, I kind of more or less close that gap? That's actually, I think, hard, particularly for, so if you look at, there has to be a maximum amount of time that you will take before servicing a guest. And for large web services where you're running and you've got hundreds of millions of people authenticating against you at any given time, if you assume a maximum 10 millisecond delay that you're willing to put into the hash iteration, and you take, 1,000 GPUs can do, just using this 10 milliseconds, they could do 10 to the 12 guesses in the 4-month campaign that we were talking about. So if you've got a guy with that kind of resources, even if you set the max of 10 milliseconds, if he throws all of that against 100 accounts, he's still able to do 10 to the 10 guesses, right? So it's pulling it all the way down to 10 to the 6 or so is not really feasible. You can pull it down from 10 to the 14, but a fairly conservative estimate says 10 to the 10 is probably about as low as you can go using iteration alone, which is one of the reasons why I think the stuff that Jeff was talking about, this morning with Argon, yes, and memory sensitive things that consume not just CPU are so interesting. But it's hard, given what we currently have, to go much lower than 10 to get to 10 to the 10, and I think numbers like 10 to the 11 or 10 to the 12 or higher are far more realistic. And it only gets worse because GPUs, generally get better, not worse. So finally, that was, okay, remember with AlphaSat, can't do much about that. T0, that's an online. Offline T1, hash iteration seems like a really good deal. Okay. And then finally, improve the password distribution. And so what tools do we have to alter the password distribution? Well, there's the usual mix, education campaigns, password meter, and blacklists, blah, 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 blah. Now, remember, what do we want, right? I mean, the don't care region told me that the distribution must be below AlphaSat at T1. And changes to the distribution in the don't care region just don't improve outcomes, at all. The problem when we try to influence outcomes, influence password distribution stuff, is that the tools that we have are largely indirect and unfocused. In other words, they're indirect because, I'm the administrator and I've got 100,000 users, and I say, users, please do this, and here's tips, and here's blah, 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 but they choose the passwords, not me, right? And I can sing and dance all I want, but they choose the passwords, and we've seen that they're largely resistant to, and they show great ingenuity in circumventing things that we thought were foolproof and getting them to choose stronger. They are unfocused in that, well, remember, the don't care region, there's big areas where, improving strength here doesn't matter. And like, if AlphaSat is 0.1, meaning the guy, an attacker saturates when he's got 10% of my network. Well, suppose I have some genius scheme that gets all of my population to increase their password strength margin. Well, 90% of that effort was just wasted straight away because 90% of your population lies above AlphaSat by definition. Everything you do, 90% of your effort is just poured down the drain. In other words, you can't focus the energy where you want it, which is on the particular cases that are causing you most problem, which is the particular cases of where the attacker has easiest time of gaining access with the fewest guesses or fewest resources. So how do we achieve this? So education and stuff like that, I think, is really. Two tools kind of stand out as blacklisting is, for online guessing in particular, it is direct and it is focused, right? By blacklisting, no, I'm sorry, the top 1,000 or 10,000 passwords from the Rocky distribution are just banned unilaterally. Sorry, you can't choose Snoopy as your password. Sorry if that's a problem. It is direct in the sense that it just forbids directly the harmful action itself, and it is focused in that it inconveniences only the people who need to be inconvenienced. The only people that you're hurting are the people who, well, these are the very ones that need to be told to change, and nobody else. Everybody who's fine is left alone. Blacklisting, I mean, I think for protection against online guessing, it's almost criminal not to do it. I think it's essentially, it is one of the biggest bangs for buck to have a banned password list of, at least the top several hundred, and I don't see good reasons not to run it out to a couple of thousand. It's good for, especially against, say, breadth first online guessing. Composition policies. In contrast to blacklisting, which is direct and focused, composition policies are indirect and unfocused. That is to say, they don't really directly address the behavior that we want, and they're not focused. They're targeted at the whole population, even when, by definition, if alpha-SAT is 10%, 90% of your population is not your problem. And in addition, password composition policies they're not even close to getting us what we actually need. I mean, if they have many sins and people hate them, but if they were delivering what we want of them, then many sins can be forgiven. Remember, we said the distribution must lie below alpha-SAT at T1. So there have been a bunch of, awesome papers out of CMU on these kind of questions. But if you take, the alpha-SAT that I've been using is, let's say, 10%, where the guy effectively has all, you're no longer denying him much access to the vision to him. And T1, I don't know, 10 to 10, 10 to 11, 10 to 12, something like that. In a study of CMU passwords, and these were actual passwords from the CMU, network, which had to be a minimum of length 8 and 3x4 characters, etc. 48% of them were guessed at 10 to 14. So, this policy, if T1 is 10 to 14, is just, no, it's not really getting you there at all. The additional effort that everybody put in above and beyond necessary to survive online guessing was entirely wasted. 22% at 10 to the 11. So unless you believe that, alpha-SAT is significantly lower than 22%, or T1 is significantly lower than 10 to the 11, this isn't even close. It's not even close to, that policy isn't even close to getting us anywhere. There was another paper, also by our friends at CMU, which looked at a bunch of, alternative policies across the mechanical Turk population. But again, things, the best of those, which was a length 16 password thing, had 12% of them fell at 10 to the 11 guesses. It's somewhat better, but it's 16 characters long, and it's still not really what you could describe as being safe if you think alpha-SAT is 10% or below. And many of the policies they tried had 30 or 50% guessed at 10 to the 11. So, case against using user effort to defend against offline. I think that there's a very strong case to be made. What do you do against online guessing? I think you use banned password lists to ban the top couple of hundred or top couple of thousand. You monitor, your service. You use IP blacklisting. You use things like that. What do you use? And lockout policies. What do you use against offline to protect the population of users to make sure that an attacker never gets above alpha-SAT? Well, let me know if you figure it out, because I don't know the way of doing it. The case against using user effort to defend against offline is that we don't know how to do it. We don't, none of the, I'm almost done. We don't know how to do it. Once you exceed the online threshold but fall short of the offline threshold, you're wasting enormous amounts of effort. The task gets harder every year as GPUs kind of follow, and none of the policies that we know of actually, if we think we have policies that are giving us resistance to offline guessing, we are simply deluding ourselves. We are simply deluding ourselves, and we are not really accomplishing anything above and beyond resistance to online. Conclusions: blacklists for online, slow hashes, to the limit of what your, the delay tolerable to your user population. And very exciting, developments in the space of not just iterative hashes, but using other resources also that are hard to parallelize. Prevent the file from leaking and detect it when it does. Composition policies. Maybe one of the poorest returns on effort, you know, in the whole space. Anyway, okay, I'm done. Thank you very much. I'll take the questions if we've.
Okay, questions. First of all, very fundamental flaw in the entire presentation.
Okay.
Cracking more passwords doesn't give the attacker anything. That's wrong. I crack passwords, and for each new one, you know, my heart is flooding with pressure. So that's fundamental. You have to change that in your presentation. You don't know this. You know these people.
Okay.
So look at that. Questions, and there are probably lots of them. There will be a speaker and participant dinner later today, and we are in Las Vegas. There's nothing else to do here but to talk about passwords. So after that dinner reception, my suggestion is, of course, to meet up at the restaurant somewhere at the hotel and discuss more about this stuff. But okay, so far away. Billy first.
Really quick, just to make sure I understand the math correctly. For a password manager, we're considering the case of a master password and thinking about offline attack scenario. Am I correct in assuming that AlphaStat is 0?
Yeah, I think AlphaStat is a property of a population of users, and for yeah.
Just making sure I understand. Well, that means that I do understand how AlphaStat works with the population. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that slow hashes and iterations are a good defense. Does that mean that really instead of concentrating on users, we should concentrate on marketers and make the pages load faster by reducing some of the tags and ads and so on? So we can use some of that delay for iteration instead of marketing.
Tell us how you really feel.
No, I think that the contribution of slow hashing to page load delay is probably very minor. Like, 10 milliseconds is below the threshold of what it meant. Would be noticeable to users. I think if you go to 100 or 1,000 milliseconds, that's going to be noticeable. But I think I chose 10 milliseconds more to the point of, if you've got, large web services that have on the order of hundreds of millions of users, and they're getting pounded all the time, and you have to handle, many. But so, I think the auth is handed off to a completely different set of servers from, so there's no reason not to tweak the delay to 10 or slightly higher milliseconds. And yeah, you could cut down on marketing.
I'll just keep up. So I very much like the approach in the focus on enterprise password management and the saturation concept is very interesting. But I think it assumes that passwords or accounts are born equal to some extent. This is not the case in the enterprise network. We have privileged accounts and we have non-privileged accounts. For a privileged account, one compromise will be sufficient to compromise the entire network. For a non-privileged account, you can compromise 40% of them and still not be able to do whatever you want in the network. So the question is, should we perhaps deploy or employ different strategies for privileged versus non-privileged accounts, and really not care about the complexity of the non-privileged account passwords, but care very much regarding the complexity of the privileged ones, maybe in the optimal case manage them automatically through some system, but at least employ a very high level of complexity on them that will affect the
Absolutely. I mean, the importance of credentials across an enterprise, varies enormously. And this sort of says, one is getting them at random. I think it is if you're trying to break in, someone who's trying to break into, say, Microsoft, doesn't try to crack, Satya Nadella's, password. I think what they try to do is get close and then work sideways once they're in. This is it's a simplified model, and yes, some things should be protected far more carefully than others. But even if you have a set of things, that the admin stuff and the CFO and all of that, it's difficult to firewall that, so that having stuff that's close doesn't allow you to work your way sideways and still get to it.
That was the last one we have time for. We have to change over to Ricky Day from CoreLogic. This is also going to be a great talk, I'm sure. So, stand up and sit down again.